Hello and welcome back to the channel where we refuse to read the rule books when we play games, and today I have decided that I'm going to make videos or deck techs about all the different Dandan variants that either I've come up with or people in our community have come up with. After releasing the video that is all about the other Dandans, which is just a bunch of Dandan variants I came up with, a lot of y'all in the community came up with your own lists, started popping into the Discord channel and putting in all of your ideas, and we've been talking and chatting about all the different ways that you can build different variants. And so what I decided to do is I'm going to make some deck techs about your ideas, and we're going to start off with this one that I have. This was an idea by TC, and their deck is called Bombdan. And now this is my version of their deck, but I do want to give like almost all the credit to TC here. And without further ado, let's get into what this deck does and what it's about. This deck is all about a card called Mind Bomb. Mind Bomb costs blue for a sorcery, and it says that it deals 3 damage to each player, but all players may discard up to 3 cards of their choice from their hands. Each card a player discards in this manner prevents 1 damage that they would take from Mind Bomb. So the idea is you are managing your hand. You'll notice that this Mind Bomb is in my sideboard, right, instead of in the actual Dandan variant deck. And there's a reason for this, because as me and TC were talking about this idea, a deck built all around Mind Bomb, there were 2 different ways we thought about this deck. You can play this one of 2 ways. For TC's version, you've got the bombs in the deck, and for my version, I have it in the sideboard. And what the sideboard means for my version is that at the beginning of each upkeep for every player, Mind Bomb gets cast. Doesn't matter who owns it or anything like that. The card Mind Bomb is getting cast, so a copy of it essentially. And because it affects both players are being affected every upkeep. Puts a lot of pressure on your hand and also on your life total. The reason I came up with this version is because in TC's original version, the player casting the Mind Bomb is at a disadvantage. Because if I cast Mind Bomb, I lose 1 card from my hand to play this, and I have to pay blue, even though it's a symmetrical effect. So technically that means that I go -1 when I want to initiate the theme of this deck. For me, I don't like the feeling of being incentivized to just never even use the card Mind Bomb, so I chose in my version to go with a different mechanic where it is technically off to the side. Oh, hey, after just super brief playtesting, super brief goldfishing even, I realized that the cast Mind Bomb at the beginning of each upkeep mechanic does not work, and you die so quickly and can't keep cards in your hand at all, and the game is not fun to play that way. So instead, I've changed the rule for this to be that instead of casting Mind Bomb at the beginning of each upkeep, and instead of putting the Mind Bombs into the deck like TC did, I am going to just say that there is a copy of Mind Bomb in a shared command zone. Players can cast a copy of it anytime during their main phase for blue, and so what it does is it kind of allows us to control when these things are happening, but we also don't have the downside of going -1 in cards to cast them like you do whenever you have Mind Bomb in the deck. But it also allows you to kind of save up for the best turn for you to go off and play like 4 Mind Bombs in a row. So this is what we're going to be testing actually whenever it comes to it, so that's what you'll be seeing. So before we get into the actual list that I'm going to be playing with whenever I test this out with my brother, let's talk about the other rule that I've added in. If we scroll up in the description of this list here on Moxfield, and by the way, if you wanted to see any of the lists that I've created so far, I will link my Moxfield into the description so you can see all of the Dandans I've made. So if we read this here, this deck is inspired by TC's deck, so it's his idea originally to build a deck around Mind Bomb. Just like all Dandans, shared deck and graveyard, each player begins with a Cursed Rack in play, targeting their opponent. And that means, if you read Cursed Rack right here, target opponent discards down to 4 cards during his or her discard phase. Now that is the old wording. The most current wording of Cursed Rack is you choose an opponent whenever it comes into play, and that player's maximum hand size is now 4. This means that both players have 4 as their maximum hand size. Now, Cursed Rack was TC's idea originally, and in TC's original list, you can see that TC also has Cursed Rack in theirs, but in their list, the Cursed Rack is in the deck. I felt like that was less realistic. It's 4 mana. It's quite a lot of mana to make this happen, and sometimes it's just not really going to matter at all in that way. I love the idea of having it start and play. The reason why I've chosen to keep it as Cursed Rack instead of just setting a rule that your maximum hand size is 4 is because Cursed Rack is a permanent that can be affected by spell. We have cards like Temporal Cleansing, which can bounce the Cursed Rack, and what that does is it gives you options for unlocking your hand size. So obviously you want to have cards in hand. Cursed Rack is trying to limit the amount of cards you can have in your hand. Mind Bomb is saying if you don't discard cards, you're going to take damage, and you'll lose the game pretty fast if you do that. In this deck, though, there are no other ways to win the game. It's just going to be surviving the Mind Bombs that are coming every single turn. But there are really interesting ways that you can play through and around the types of hand sculpting that's going on. So, for example, let's first start off by pointing out the card Minimo Scrollkeeper. Is a 2/3 for 2 defender. Your maximum hand size is increased by 1. This card is going to be another way where you can slowly unlock some of your hand to get a larger hand size, hold more cards in hand, or when you draw a bunch of cards, have more cards in hand for whenever the Mind Bomb gets cast that you can discard to not take damage. We've got Bonded Fetch that can let you loot Geist of the Archives. Scrying is really cool in a shared deck format because it means you can choose what you draw, but also with some other types of scry, it'll affect what your opponent draws. For example, Glistener Seer here has an instant speed ability to tap, remove an oil counter, and scry one. You can do this before your opponent draws to affect what's on top of the deck. Time Elemental is really cool here. The first part of its text you really don't need to worry about. Time Elemental here is a 0/2 for 2 and a blue, and if it attacks or blocks, it's going to deal 5 damage to you. Obviously we're not doing that. Instead, we just care about the second effect. It costs 2 blue, tap. You can return target permanent with no enchantments on it or auras to its owner's hand. So something that doesn't have any auras on it can be bounced. And it's any permanent, so lands, whatever you want. This is a great way to make your opponent recast their Cursed Racks, unlock your hand so you no longer have to discard down. It also allows you to reset their maximum hand size, maybe lower it with bouncing the Minimo Scrollkeeper or bouncing any other permanents they have, or to rebuy some of your own cards that you want to draw cards with. I want to point out a couple other cards here. Nagging Thoughts and Obsessive Search are 2 very important cards in this deck. So there's only 2 Nagging Thoughts, but 10 Obsessive Search. And the key here is that these cards have Madness. Madness says whenever you discard this card, you can cast it for its Madness cost. So what these 2 cards are doing, so Nagging Thoughts is 1 in a blue, look at the top 2 cards of your library, put 1 in your hand, 1 in your graveyard, and then Obsessive Search is just draw card. So what you're doing here is you're making up for having to discard cards, whether that be when you discard these cards to Mind Bomb, you can cast them for their Madness cost and make up for the fact that you had to discard them. Keep your hand size big. Now, next thing I want to point out is we've got all these creatures, and one of the things it's going to be able to do is help us cast cards with Convoke. So, Temporal Cleansing here, 3 in a blue, Convoke. The owner of target non-land permanent puts it into their library second from the top or on the bottom. We can Convoke. Our Minimo Scrollkeepers and all these other creatures are going to help us pay for this cost. We also have Complete the Circuit, is 5 in a blue, also has Convoke. You may cast sorcery spells this turn as though they had flash. When you cast an instant or sorcery spell this turn, copy that spell twice. You may choose new targets for the copies. Complete the Circuit is a really great card unless you're not convoking it, right? You need to convoke this card for it to be worth. Next thing that's really cool, so another card I want to point out that TC was a big fan of, and I kind of like it a lot too, is Psychic Transfer. So if you've never seen Psychic Transfer before, Psychic Transfer says if the difference between your life total and target player's life total is 5 or less, exchange your life totals. In the grand scheme of Magic, this card is really bad, but Dan variants are all about finding unique and cool cards and making them matter in ways that they wouldn't have otherwise mattered. So Psychic Transfer here in a format where the increments of damage are 3 at a time and your life totals really matter where they're at because they're never going higher, right? Your life total can't go up except for with this card in this format. Psychic Transfer becomes a much stronger card because if you are at 15 and your opponent's at 20, that swap is a 10 life swing. That's huge in a format like that, and it puts you ahead when you were behind. You can play into this because you can control how much damage you're taking with Mind Bomb. You can say, this turn I'm not going to discard any cards, I'm just going to take 3 because I know I've got Psychic Transfer, I'm going to be using this on my opponent. But be careful, there are counterspells in this format, so you've got to be very careful about this kind of stuff. We have Deprive that lets you bounce a land back to your hand. We have Dismal Failure that makes your opponent discard a card. And then another card that I think is kind of unique in this list is going to be Teachings of the Archaics. Teachings of the Archaics is pretty bad divination. 2 and a blue if an opponent has more cards in hand than you, draw 2 cards. Draw 3 if they have at least 4 more cards in hand. But what's cool about this, along with Psychic Transfer, and also Windfall, by the way, Windfall's really good at this too, is these are catch-up cards in a format that is all about hand size. It's all about how many cards are in my hand, what is my maximum hand size. Another card that I think is really neat is Wistful Thinking. Wistful Thinking is 2 and a blue, target player draws 2 cards, then discards 4 cards. Wistful Thinking is a really cool card that is like a Mind Rot where it makes them discard 2 cards, but it is worse than that because if they have 3 cards in hand, they go up to 5 and they can keep their best of those 5. So you are kind of setting them up to maybe draw a card that is better than what was already in their hand, but it's really cool because they discard 4 cards and it's weird in the format. You can choose to do it to yourself as well if you've got enough mana to use your madness effects with it. I just think it's fun to have in this format. Oh, also wanted to point out there are 10 Memorial to Genius because it is the card draw sacrifice land. Very cool for a format like this where that matters so much. It is expensive, lots of mana, but by the time we get to this point in the game, cashing in for cards is going to be a big deal. So yeah, this is my version of Mind Bomb. And I'm recording this before I've actually played the deck with my brother, but as you've probably seen in the background of this video, I have footage running of my brother and I play testing these decks. So the plan is that we are going to play these decks, and then I'm going to provide my feedback on how well I thought it went, what cards I might change in it, and so forth. But first, before I do that, I'll play some footage so you can see what it's like, and then I'll come back and give you my review of this deck. So this footage right here was the second match that my brother and I played. The one you already saw in the background was the first one. In this one, I went first, and I decided on the first turn of the game, because I had Madness cards in hand, I was going to discard down to hand size, discarding some of the Madness cards, and then cast one of the Obsessive Searches from that. Now what happens here is I draw a card, but then I still have more than my maximum hand size, so I have to discard again. This is how the cleanup step works. If you have more than maximum hand size in the cleanup step, you will then discard again if any triggers go on the stack during the cleanup step. This is actually something I learned in the first match because I didn't know that with my brother. Then he plays a Memorial to Genius and then discards down to hand size himself. After that, goes to my turn. He's pointing out a couple of cards that he likes or doesn't like, and I show him the mechanic that if you use Boomerang to bounce a Cursed Rack, it unlocks your hand size, and now your maximum hand size is bigger again. That's a very cool interaction here that's going on. I untap, it's now my turn again, and then I say go to him, because I am going to try and build up my hand and keep it as big as possible. Now, over the course of this game, that is pretty much what happens. I keep a larger hand size than my brother, I draw as many cards as I can, and that allows me to leverage my Mind Bomb casts better than he can. I cast a Minimal Scroll Keeper that increases my maximum hand size, and then he casts a Jacob Hauken so he can start looting. However, this is when I realized that my ability to keep a card advantage threshold above him allows me to just start casting Mind Bombs. So that's what I start doing. You'll notice here I just tap both of my lands to cast 2 Mind Bombs, dealing damage to both of us and ending up causing us to need to discard a couple of cards here and there to keep our life totals high. For my current setup in my hand, pressure is the name of the game because I actually don't have very many lands. So I'm not going to be able to cast very many other spells. So I try and keep cards in hand so that I will be able to cast as many Mind Bombs as possible. And as long as my brother doesn't draw enough card advantage spells, I will win. Now, he has 2 creatures in play that allow him to loot. He has Bonded Fetch and Jacob Hauken. Both of these will allow him to draw a card and then discard a card in some fashion. Jacob Hauken puts it underneath Jacob, and then you can flip it and start casting those spells for free. If at any point during this process, while he is casting his spells, looting through the deck, he gets some card advantage spells and is able to maybe do a draw 2 card spell or leverage his draw discard into Obsessive Searches to gain additional card advantage, he would get ahead of me at that point. So my goal is to put the pressure on as fast as possible. I pedal to the metal and I'm casting Mind Bombs regularly. Not every turn, but most turns I'm casting 1 or 2 Mind Bombs. Now here you'll see I cast Omen of the Sea, and my goal here is to look at the top 2 cards and keep the best one and put the other one on top underneath it so that he draws it, because in a shared deck format, when I'm scrying, I can also choose what my opponent is drawing. So I give him a land that I don't need and I keep a different card. The card I kept was Psychic Transfer, but it didn't end up mattering in this match. I never got to that many cards in hand. At this point, I have more cards than my brother, and that is what I'm going to be leveraging to win this game. I have 4 and now 5 after drawing a card, and he has 2. As long as I can cast enough Mind Bombs before he draws a card advantage spell, this game will be over. As the turns progress, that's exactly how things go. Sometimes in Bombdan, you have to recognize when you're the one putting pressure on your opponent, and when you're the one trying to build up a hand. In this situation, my brother plays his 6th land in hopes of using his Memorial to Geniuses to build up his hand size, but at this point I had already cast enough Mind Bombs to put him down to 6, which is a very scary territory to be in. When you're that low, every card matters, and when he only has 2 cards in hand, it doesn't take very many Mind Bomb casts to kill him. Just 3 of them, and I have exactly 3 lands. Now, from my perspective at this point in the game, I am trying to play around any card advantage spell or any madness spell he could have drawn. But I do know that since he only has 2 cards in hand, it is a really good play for me to just start pressuring him in this manner. And that's what ends up happening. This play of mine, putting him on this clock, is what wins me this game. So when you're playing Bombdan, be on the lookout for these scenarios where you can take advantage of the way your opponent is playing. I'll also mention something. If my brother here had played less of his lands and kept more of them in hand, he might have actually been able to save himself from this point in the game. So be aware when you need to stop playing lands and keep them in your hand in order to play around your opponent pressuring you with Mind Bombs. So after playing Bombdan a couple of times and getting a good idea of what the format's about, how it feels to play it, I have a better understanding of my full thoughts and sort of a review of it. First things first, very fun. It's just a blast. I love getting to use cards that I've never really seen before in unique and weird ways for Magic, and I feel like Dandan and Dandan variants are the perfect outlet to use the coolest and most unique cards in Magic, and this is just a prime example of this. The way that it feels to have this pressure clock of the external Mind Bomb that you and your opponent can just cast whenever you need to is really cool, and as we could see in that one game I was narrating, being able to tell whether you're on the side who needs to be pressuring or whether you're on the side who needs to be protecting is a very interesting dynamic to the game. And after playing it a little bit, I have come to a conclusion about some cards. There are certainly some really cool cards. Love the Convoke stuff. It's very cool to have these creatures that do abilities that are not attacking and blocking and have another utility to them. So I actually highly recommend, from the list that I have linked, you add in that 4 mana divination with Convoke. I believe it's Meeting of the Minds or something like that. It's a very cool card. All the Convoke cards were very interesting and cool to try and put together. Complete the circuit, very fun to play with. So I really like all of that. Most of the cards in the deck were very fun to play with. The Madness stuff is very interesting. But one thing we did realize is we feel like there needed to be more card advantage spells in the deck. One of the surprise sleeper cards in the deck for how powerful it was the card Tragic Lesson. And that card is 2 and a blue, instant, draw 2 cards, then discard a card unless you return a land you control to your hand. This is 3 mana, put 3 cards in your hand. That's what it's doing in the deck, and that's so important in a format like Bombdan. So I really liked that card, and we actually were considering going up to 4 copies of it. I do like the symmetry of having 2 copies of almost everything except for things like Minimo Scrollkeeper, but Tragic Lesson was so smooth and good to play with in this that I really do recommend upping the numbers for your list. That's what we're probably going to do. Also, a couple of other key standouts here that I wanted to mention. Windfall is a very powerful catch-up card. Highly recommend you do not sleep on this card in the deck. It's a very important card to put in here for people to be able to catch up. Similar thing with Teachings of the Archaics. Teachings of the Archaics is a very important card for catching up. However, there are 2 cards that I really do recommend just removing altogether and replacing with something else. One of those is going to be Inspired Idea. Inspired Idea was cool because it manipulates your hand size. So by the way, Inspired Idea is 2 and a blue for a sorcery. that says draw 3 cards, your maximum hand size is reduced by 3 for the rest of the game, but it has cleave for 3 blue, which removes the text from the card that says that it reduces your hand size. The problem is 5 mana is a lot for draw 3. It is reasonable, you'll do it in this format, but you don't want to tap out all your mana all the time like that whenever your opponent could be casting a Mind Bomb that you're going to want to be able to use your Madness spells on. And reducing your maximum hand size is a non-starter. You will never cast Inspired Idea for 3 mana. It is a horrible play in this format. Unless you have like 3 or 4 Minima Scroll Keepers, you are never doing that, and so I just don't recommend putting it in the deck. I would replace it with the Meeting of the Minds card. I think that's the card you should replace it with. Last card I want to point out, Shorekeeper. Blue, 0/3, creature that has 7 and a blue, tap, sacrifice, draw 3 cards. I thought it would be cool because it's a early card you can play on turn 1 so you don't just lose cards to hand size, and a card that could get you back cards later and use for Convoke. The problem is you're never going to have 8 lands in play in this deck. You should be keeping lands in your hand at different points in the game. 6 is probably the maximum lands you should have in play at any given time so that you can activate your Memorial to Genius, but in general, you probably should not be keeping that many lands in play, and thus, you're never really going to ever be able to use Shorekeeper's ability. So I recommend finding another creature to replace Shorekeeper with. Something interesting, something that you think would be cool to put in that slot. Whatever you find, I hope you let me know in the comments what it is that you find, but Shorekeeper is just not a real card in this deck, so I don't recommend it. Other than that, most of the other cards were interesting and fun. They had different uses at different times. Other than that, that's my conclusion on this format. I think it's really cool. You should absolutely give it a try. Build a version of this deck. It's super fun. The Mind Bomb is a very, very fun sort of mind game. But yeah, that's everything. Thank you for watching. If you have any ideas for decks or Dandan variants, please put them in the comments. I will be making your decks and making videos for them. So if you want to see your deck in a video, please put it in the comments.